The heated exchange within the halls of Congress regarding the events of January 6 continues to serve as a profound testament to the ideological fractures currently defining the American landscape. During a recent high-stakes hearing, Representative Jared Moskowitz engaged in a sharp verbal sparring match that laid bare the irreconcilable interpretations of the unrest at the United States Capitol. Moskowitz pointedly dismantled the narrative that the gathering was either a peaceful assembly or a sophisticated operation orchestrated by clandestine government actors. He specifically targeted the recurring claims surrounding individuals like Riot, treating such theories as a diversion from the raw reality of the day. By framing the actions of the participants as a series of deliberate criminal choices, the congressman sought to isolate the blame on those who physically breached the perimeter. The atmosphere in the hearing room shifted dramatically when Thomas Speciale, a former intelligence official, offered a starkly different account of the tactical failures on the ground. Speciale argued that the escalation of violence was not an inevitable outcome of the protest, but rather a direct result of law enforcement's strategic blunders. He contended that the decision by Capitol Police to deploy chemical irritants into a crowd that included numerous military veterans was the primary catalyst for the subsequent chaos. According to this perspective, what the world witnessed was not a planned insurrection but a spontaneous reaction to perceived institutional aggression. This interpretation suggests that the crowd felt compelled to defend themselves against a force they believed had overstepped its constitutional boundaries. As the debate intensified, the core of the disagreement moved beyond simple facts and into the territory of moral and legal culpability. Moskowitz maintained a rigid stance that every individual who entered the restricted grounds must be held accountable for their own agency and subsequent violations of federal law. He dismissed the notion that external provocation by police or undercover agents could ever justify the destruction of property or the disruption of a joint session of Congress. To him, the sanctity of the democratic process outweighs any grievances about the methods used by law enforcement to protect the building. This position reflects a broader commitment to the rule of law as an absolute standard regardless of the political motivations involved. In contrast, Speciale's testimony emphasized the nuance of crowd psychology and the potential for official mismanagement to transform a peaceful demonstration into a battlefield. He posited that when the state uses overwhelming force against its citizens without clear justification, it loses its moral authority and invites a defensive response. This line of reasoning seeks to humanize the protesters by framing them as victims of a system that failed to communicate or de-escalate effectively. By highlighting his background and intelligence, Speciale added a layer of perceived professional expertise to his critique of the security apparatus. His arguments resonate with a significant portion of the public that remains skeptical of the official government version of the events. The tension between these two figures illustrates the broader struggle to define the legacy of January 6 for future generations of American citizens. If Moskowitz's view prevails, the day will be remembered strictly as a criminal assault on the heart of the Republic that required the full weight of the justice system to rectify. If Speciale's perspective gains more traction, it could lead to a fundamental re-evaluation of how federal agencies interact with large-scale political protests in the Capitol. The implications of this debate extend far beyond the walls of the committee room, influencing legislative reforms and the training protocols for various security forces. It is a conflict where the definition of patriotism and the definition of criminality are constantly being renegotiated by those in power. The skepticism voiced by Moskowitz regarding the Riot's theory is particularly notable because it addresses one of the most persistent claims in the post-January 6 discourse. Many critics of the official investigation have pointed to Epps as a potential provocateur whose presence suggests a deeper level of federal involvement in the riot. Moskowitz, however, views these claims as an attempt to shift the blame away from the individuals who chose to break windows and assault officers. He uses the power of the Congressional platform to demand a return to evidence-based accusations rather than what he characterizes as speculative fiction. This rejection of conspiracy theories is a key pillar of his strategy to uphold the integrity of the committee's findings. However, the counter-arguments presented by witnesses like Speciale continue to find an audience among those who feel marginalized by the current political establishment. They argue that the focus on individual criminal acts ignores the systemic issues and the perceived heavy-handedness of the Department of Justice. By focusing on the use of tear gas, Speciale highlights a specific moment of tactical engagement that many observers find deeply problematic from a civil liberties perspective. He suggests that the presence of veterans in the crowd should have signaled a need for a more restrained and respectful approach by the Capitol Police. This clash of viewpoints ensures that the investigation remains a deeply partisan and emotionally charged issue for the foreseeable future. The discussion also touched upon the technical aspects of perimeter security and the failure to anticipate the sheer scale of the arriving crowds. Lawmakers are forced to grapple with the question of whether the intelligence community failed to identify the threat or if the leadership simply failed to act on the information available. Moskowitz tends to focus on the intent of the marchers, while Speciale focuses on the failures of the protective architecture surrounding the Capitol. Both agree that the day was a tragedy, but they find no common ground on the sequence of events that led to the breach. This fundamental disagreement on the timeline and causality makes any bipartisan consensus nearly impossible to achieve. Ultimately, this congressional hearing serves as a microcosm of the national divide, where two groups of people can watch the same video and see two entirely different realities. One side sees a clear-cut case of domestic terrorism that must be punished to prevent any future recurrence of such instability. The other side sees a complex social eruption fueled by legitimate grievances and exacerbated by a failed government response. The role of the media and digital platforms in amplifying these conflicting narratives cannot be understated as they provide the fuel for continued debate. As the investigations continue, the American public is left to decide which interpretation aligns more closely with their own values and observations. The scrutiny of digital evidence has become the centerpiece of this legislative inquiry, as both sides attempt to weaponize thousands of hours of surveillance footage. Representative Moskowitz has frequently pointed to high-definition recordings that show the initial breach of the barriers as undeniable proof of premeditated aggression. In his view, the visual record displays a clear transition from political protest to a coordinated assault on a federal facility. He argues that the sheer volume of individuals wearing tactical gear suggests a level of preparation that transcends a spontaneous reaction to police presence. This focus on the visual evidence is designed to strip away the rhetorical layers and force a confrontation with the physical violence of the day. By emphasizing the actions captured on camera, he seeks to establish a baseline of facts that cannot be easily dismissed by political spin. On the other side of the witness table, the interpretation of this same footage takes a radically different turn when analyzed through a tactical lens. Thomas Speciale and other critics of the official narrative suggest that the video shows a lack of clear direction and a breakdown in the chain of command. They point to specific frames where the use of non-lethal munitions appears to be directed at non-aggressive segments of the crowd. This, they argue, created a bottleneck effect that pushed the masses toward the building as a means of escaping the chemical clouds. From this perspective, the video does not show a planned invasion but a chaotic survival response triggered by poor field management. This technical analysis attempts to recontextualize the aggression as a byproduct of a poorly executed crowd control strategy. The debate over the role of undercover elements and informants adds another layer of complexity to the interpretation of the video records. Lawmakers have spent countless hours debating the identity and intent of certain individuals seen in the footage who appeared to be directing traffic or encouraging the breach. Moskowitz remains steadfast in his assertion that these theories are a distraction intended to muddy the waters of accountability. He maintains that unless there is concrete, verifiable evidence of federal entrapment, the focus must remain on the citizens who chose to participate. For him, the existence of a few suspicious actors does not negate the culpability of the thousands who followed them into the Capitol. This position is a defense of the institutional integrity of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and other security agencies. Conversely, the insistence on investigating potential provocateurs stems from a deep-seated distrust of the administrative state that has grown in recent years. Critics argue that the refusal to fully disclose the number of confidential human sources present that day is an admission of some level of complicity. They suggest that the video evidence is incomplete without a full accounting of who was in the crowd and what their specific missions were. Speciale's testimony reflects a belief that the truth of January 6th is buried beneath layers of classified information and selective editing. This line of inquiry seeks to prove that the insurrection was, at least in part, a staged event designed to discredit a specific political movement. This creates a fundamental impasse where the very nature of reality is being contested through the lens of partisan suspicion. The psychological impact of the tear gas and flashbangs on the veterans in the crowd is a point of significant contention that Speciale highlights. He argues that for individuals with military training, these sensory inputs trigger a specific set of instincts related to combat and self-preservation. When the police deployed these measures, they may have inadvertently activated a fight or flight response in a highly disciplined segment of the audience. This perspective suggests that the resulting conflict was a tragic misunderstanding between two groups of people who both believed they were doing their duty. It frames the violence not as an act of treason, but as a catastrophic failure of communication in a high-pressure environment. This narrative seeks to bridge the gap between the protesters' actions and their identity as patriotic citizens. However, the legal framework governing the protection of the Capitol does not easily accommodate the idea of provoked trespassing or assault. Moskowitz has been quick to remind the committee that the legal standard for obstruction of an official proceeding does not depend on the mood of the crowd. If an individual crosses a restricted line and interferes with the functions of government, the motive becomes secondary to the act itself. The congressman's arguments are rooted in a traditionalist view of law and order that prioritizes the stability of the state above all else. He warns that allowing provocation as a defense would set a dangerous precedent for future political unrest on either side of the aisle. This legalistic approach is intended to provide a clear and unambiguous path for the ongoing prosecutions. The role of the media in shaping these perceptions is also a recurring theme in the congressional dialogue. Both Moskowitz and the witnesses are aware that their words are being broadcast to a divided nation, where each side consumes a different version of the truth. The use of curated video clips by major news networks has contributed to a situation where two Americans can have diametrically opposed understandings of the same event. Moskowitz criticizes certain media outlets for giving oxygen to what he calls fringe theories that undermine public confidence in the justice system. Meanwhile, his opponents argue that the mainstream narrative is a form of state-sponsored propaganda that ignores the legitimate concerns of the protesters. This media environment makes the task of the committee even more difficult, as any finding is likely to be viewed through a partisan filter. Furthermore, the discussion has touched upon the equipment and training of the Capitol Police in the months leading up to the event. There is a growing consensus that the officers on the front lines were placed in an impossible situation with inadequate resources and conflicting orders. Moskowitz uses this point to argue for increased funding and better intelligence sharing to protect the citadel of democracy. In contrast, Speciale uses the same facts to suggest that the leadership of the police department was either incompetent or intentionally negligent. This creates a strange political alignment where both sides are criticizing the same institution but for completely opposite reasons. It highlights the difficulty of achieving any kind of meaningful reform when the diagnosis of the problem is so deeply polarized. As the hearing progressed, the focus often shifted to the specific actions of the Department of Justice in the years following the riot. The aggressive pursuit of hundreds of individuals for nonviolent offenses has become a major talking point for those who share Speciale's views. They argue that the weaponization of the legal system is a greater threat to the country than the events of January 6th itself. Moskowitz, however, views these prosecutions as a necessary and measured response to an unprecedented threat. He argues that the scale of the investigation is a reflection of the scale of the crime, not a sign of political bias. This clash over the definition of justice is perhaps the most enduring legacy of the entire controversy. The testimony also delved into the specific interactions between police officers and protesters that were captured on body-worn cameras. Some videos show officers appearing to step aside or even engage in friendly conversation with those who had entered the building. For Speciale, these moments are proof that the situation was not a violent takeover but a confusing and somewhat fluid encounter. He argues that if the police did not treat every individual as a threat at the moment, the government should not do so after the fact. Moskowitz counters this by pointing to the hundreds of other videos showing brutal hand-to-hand combat and the use of improvised weapons against the police. He insists that a few moments of calm or confusion do not negate the overall atmosphere of violence and intimidation that defined the day. The subsequent legal fallout from the events at the Capitol has ignited a firestorm of controversy regarding the equitable application of justice in a polarized society. Representative Moskowitz has consistently championed the Department of Justice's efforts, framing the massive wave of arrests as a vital restoration of the rule of law. He contends that the sheer scale of the judicial response is commensurate with the gravity of an attempt to obstruct the peaceful transfer of power. From his vantage point, any characterization of these defendants as victims of political persecution is a dangerous subversion of the American legal tradition. He argues that the court system provides the ultimate venue for truth, where evidence outweighs rhetoric and due process is meticulously observed. This staunch defense of the judiciary seeks to reassure the public that the institutions of the state remain impartial and resilient. However, a contrasting narrative has taken hold among those who align with the skeptical views expressed by Thomas Speciale during the hearings. This perspective posits that the federal government has crossed a line from legitimate prosecution into the realm of political retribution against a specific segment of the electorate. Critics point to the lengthy pretrial detentions and the aggressive sentencing recommendations for nonviolent offenders as evidence of a double standard. They argue that the legal system is being utilized to send a chilling message to any future dissenters who challenge the established political order. In this view, the term political prisoner is not a rhetorical flourish but a sober assessment of what they perceive as a systemic bias. This profound distrust of the Department of Justice represents a significant shift in how a large portion of the population views federal law enforcement. The debate over the sentencing of individuals who did not engage in physical violence but were present on restricted grounds is particularly contentious. Moskowitz maintains that the act of breaching the perimeter was a collective effort that empowered the most violent actors within the crowd. He suggests that without the sheer mass of people providing cover and momentum, the most egregious assaults on police would not have been possible. Therefore, in his eyes, every individual who entered the building bears a degree of responsibility for the collective outcome of the day. This theory of collective culpability is central to the government's strategy to deter any future large-scale civil disturbances. It reflects a zero-tolerance approach to the violation of federal space, regardless of the individual's personal conduct once inside. Speciale's testimony, however, challenges this broad-brush approach by emphasizing the specific circumstances and motivations of many who were caught up in the chaos. He suggests that many attendees believed they were being ushered in by police or that the barriers had been removed by official decree. For these individuals, the sudden transition from peaceful protester to federal defendant has been a traumatic and life-altering experience. Speciale argues that the government's refusal to acknowledge the role of police escalation in creating this confusion is a failure of basic fairness. He posits that the justice system should be capable of distinguishing between those with malicious intent and those who are victims of a chaotic environment. This focus on individual context seeks to dismantle the narrative of a monolithic insurrectionist mob. The debate also extends to the conditions of confinement for those awaiting trial in the District of Columbia. Reports of restrictive housing and limited access to legal counsel have become a rallying cry for those who believe the defendants are being treated unfairly. Moskowitz has largely dismissed these concerns as exaggerated or as a necessary consequence of the logistical challenges posed by such a massive caseload. He emphasizes that the defendants have access to the same constitutional protections as any other citizen facing federal charges. To him, the focus on jail conditions is a strategic attempt to distract from the underlying crimes that led to the incarcerations in the first place. He warns that sympathizing with the defendants risks validating the very actions that threaten the stability of the government. In stark contrast, the focus on due process has become a central pillar of the defense for those who feel the system has been weaponized. Critics argue that the political climate in the District of Columbia makes it nearly impossible for a January 6 defendant to receive a fair trial by a jury of their peers. They point to the high conviction rates as evidence of a predetermined outcome driven by a community that was personally impacted by the events. Speciale and others have suggested that changing the venue for these trials is a necessary step to ensure the integrity of the judicial process. This proposal is rooted in the belief that the geographical and political concentration of the cases has created a feedback loop of condemnation. This challenge to the fundamental fairness of the trial process goes to the heart of the American promise of equal justice under the law. The role of obstruction of an official proceeding as a primary charge has also come under intense legal scrutiny and debate within the halls of Congress. This specific statute, originally intended to combat corporate fraud and witness tampering, has been applied to hundreds of January 6 cases. Moskowitz defends the use of this charge, arguing that the disruption of the Electoral College certification fits the plain meaning of the law. He views the attempt to stop a constitutional process as the ultimate form of obstruction that the statute was designed to prevent. For him, the creative application of the law is a necessary tool for addressing a unique and unprecedented threat to the Republic. This interpretation prioritizes the protection of government functions over a narrow or historical reading of the legislative text. However, legal scholars and advocates on the other side argue that this application of the law represents a dangerous case of prosecutorial overreach. They contend that using a white-collar crime statute to punish political protesters sets a precedent that could be used against any group that disrupts a government meeting. Speciale's arguments reflect a fear that the expanding definition of obstruction will eventually be used to criminalize a wide range of First Amendment activities. This legal debate has reached the highest levels of the American judiciary, illustrating the profound uncertainty surrounding the limits of federal power. The outcome of these legal challenges will have a lasting impact on how future protests are policed and prosecuted in the United States. This is not just a battle over the past, but a struggle to define the boundaries of dissent for the future. The psychological toll on the families of the defendants is another dimension that is frequently highlighted by those who criticize the government's response. They speak of broken homes, lost livelihoods, and a sense of betrayal by a government they once trusted. Speciale's testimony often touches on the human cost of what he perceives as a heavy-handed and politically motivated crackdown. He argues that the long-term impact on the social fabric of the country will be devastating if millions of citizens feel they are being treated as enemies of the state. This emotional appeal seeks to shift the focus from the technicalities of the law to the broader concepts of national reconciliation and healing. It suggests that a more lenient or understanding approach would be more effective in preventing future instability. Moskowitz, however, remains unmoved by these appeals, arguing that the primary duty of the government is to uphold the law and protect the institutions of democracy. He contends that the true human cost was borne by the police officers who were injured and the democratic system that was brought to the brink of collapse. For him, any move toward leniency would be interpreted as a sign of weakness and an invitation to further violence. He believes that the only path to national healing is through a full and uncompromising accounting of the day's events. This rigid adherence to the principle of accountability is framed as a form of tough love for the Republic. It is a philosophy that views the preservation of order as the highest moral calling of a public servant. The examination of the security apparatus leading up to the events at the Capitol has revealed a staggering disconnect between intelligence gathering and operational execution. During the hearings, the debate often pivoted toward whether the failure to secure the building was a matter of simple incompetence or something more calculated. Representative Moskowitz has framed the security breakdown as a tragic byproduct of an unprecedented surge in civil unrest that overwhelmed existing protocols. He emphasizes that the blame lies with the individuals who attacked, not the institutions that were momentarily breached under extreme pressure. In this view, the solution is to strengthen the authority and resources of federal agencies to ensure such a lapse never occurs again. This perspective treats the intelligence community as a vital but fallible shield that requires more support from the legislative branch. Conversely, the testimony provided by Thomas Speciale brings a much more skeptical eye to the role of the intelligence and security agencies. As a former insider, he suggests that the failure to act on available intelligence was so profound that it borders on the suspicious. He argues that the lack of preparation provided a convenient pretext for the subsequent crackdown on civil liberties and political dissent. This line of reasoning taps into a broader American anxiety regarding the deep state and its potential to influence domestic political outcomes. By highlighting the gap between what was known and what was done, Speciale challenges the notion that the government was merely a passive victim of the day's events. He posits that the inaction of leadership was a form of strategic silence that allowed the situation to spiral out of control for political gain. The discussion regarding the specific role of the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security has become a flashpoint for these conflicting theories. Moskowitz has defended these agencies against what he calls baseless attacks on their professional integrity and constitutional commitment. He points out that these agencies are composed of thousands of dedicated civil servants who work tirelessly to protect the country from various threats. For him, the focus on a few anomalous events or unidentified individuals in the crowd is a form of cherry-picking intended to delegitimize the entire security state. He maintains that the real danger to the country comes from those who seek to erode public trust in these essential institutions. This defense is a call for national unity behind the agencies that serve as the backbone of federal law enforcement. However, the lack of transparency regarding the number and activities of confidential human sources on that day continues to fuel intense debate. Speciale and other critics argue that the American public has a right to know if federal assets were involved in encouraging or directing the breach. They contend that the refusal of agency leaders to answer direct questions on this topic is a major red flag that cannot be ignored. This skepticism is rooted in a historical awareness of past federal operations that have used informants to infiltrate and influence political movements. For this group, The silence of the agencies is not a matter of national security, but a matter of self-protection and the avoidance of accountability. They argue that true closure for the events of January 6th is impossible without a full and public audit of the intelligence community's domestic operations. The technical failures of the communication systems used by the Capitol Police have also been subjected to intense scrutiny by the committee. Reports have surfaced of officers being unable to receive orders or share critical information during the height of the confrontation. Moskowitz uses these failures to argue for a comprehensive modernization of the Capitol's security infrastructure and better coordination between local and federal forces. He views these issues as technical glitches that can be solved through increased funding and technological upgrades. This approach seeks to depoliticize the failure by treating it as a management and procurement problem rather than a systemic moral failure. It focuses on the how of the security breach rather than the why of the leadership's decision-making process. In contrast, Speciale interprets these communication breakdowns as evidence of a deeper structural rot within the leadership of the security forces. He argues that in any high-stakes operation, the loss of command and control is a failure of the highest order that reflects a lack of professional readiness. He suggests that the fog of war was exacerbated by leaders who were more concerned with optics than with the safety of their officers and the public. This perspective frames the tactical chaos as a reflection of the political confusion at the top levels of the government. For Speciale, the solution is not just better equipment, but a fundamental change in the culture and leadership of the agencies responsible for the Capitol's safety. He calls for a return to a more transparent and accountable model of policing that respects the rights of the citizenry. The debate also touches upon the legal authorities granted to the National Guard and the delays in their deployment on that day. There has been significant finger-pointing between the Pentagon, the Mayor's office, and the leadership of the Capitol Police regarding who had the authority to call in reinforcements. Moskowitz has tended to focus on the bureaucratic hurdles and the lack of a clear chain of command as the primary reasons for the delay. He argues that these procedural bottlenecks must be cleared to ensure a more rapid response to future emergencies. This focus on administrative reform is intended to provide a constructive path forward that avoids assigning individual blame for the slow response. It is a pragmatic attempt to learn from the mistakes of the past without engaging in a political witch hunt. However, for those who share the views of the witnesses, the delay in deploying the National Guard is seen as one of the most damning pieces of evidence. They argue that the hesitation to bring in overwhelming force suggests that some actors within the government may have wanted the chaos to persist. This deliberate delay theory posits that the images of a besieged capital were more valuable to the political establishment than a quick restoration of order. Speciale's testimony emphasizes the frustration of military veterans who saw the lack of a decisive response as a betrayal of their own values of duty and protection. This creates a narrative of a government that is not only incompetent but potentially manipulative in its use of state power. It is a profound indictment of the motives behind the actions, or inactions, of the highest levels of the military and civilian leadership. The intersection of domestic policy and national security has also been reshaped by the events of January 6th and the subsequent investigations. There is a growing debate over whether the focus on domestic violent extremism has led to an overreach that infringes on the First Amendment rights of ordinary citizens. Moskowitz argues that the threat from within is just as real as any foreign threat and requires a robust and proactive government response. He supports the expansion of domestic surveillance and investigative tools to identify and disrupt potential insurgents before they can act. This position is based on the belief that the security of the state is the prerequisite for all other freedoms. He views the January 6th riot as a wake-up call that exposed the vulnerability of the American system to internal fracture. On the other hand, critics like Speciale warn that the war on terror framework is being dangerously misapplied to the American domestic landscape. They argue that labeling political opponents as extremists or terrorists is a hallmark of authoritarian regimes, not a healthy democracy. They fear that the expanded powers of the security state will inevitably be used to silence legitimate political dissent and protest. This debate highlights the delicate balance between security and liberty that has been a constant theme in American history. As the government continues to refine its domestic security policies, the legacy of January 6th remains the primary justification for a more intrusive and powerful federal presence. This transformation of the domestic security environment is perhaps the most significant and long-lasting consequence of that day's events. The concluding chapters of this congressional inquiry reflect a nation standing at a crossroads, grappling with the weight of its own history and the fragility of its future. Representative Moskowitz has consistently used his closing remarks to emphasize the necessity of a unified national memory regarding the events of January 6th. He argues that without a shared understanding of what constitutes a crime and what constitutes a protest, the very foundations of the Republic remain at risk. For him, the path to healing requires a total rejection of the revisionist history that seeks to downplay the violence or shift the blame to the state. He views the work of the committee not just as a legal exercise, but as a moral imperative to safeguard the democratic experiment for future generations. This vision is one of restoration through accountability, where the truth is used as a tool to rebuild the walls of institutional trust. In stark contrast, the perspective championed by Thomas Speciale and other dissenting voices suggests that a unified narrative is impossible when so many feel unheard. They argue that as long as the government refuses to address the tactical failures and the potential for provocation, any official report will be viewed as partisan propaganda. This viewpoint posits that the real healing can only begin when there is a transparent and honest accounting of the actions taken by both the protesters and the police. For them, the insistence on a single, government-approved version of events is a sign of authoritarianism rather than a hallmark of a healthy democracy. They believe that the American people are capable of handling the complexity of a situation where there were no clear heroes and many shared failures. This call for nuance is a challenge to the binary good versus evil framing that has dominated the public discourse. The cultural impact of these hearings extends far beyond the legislative record, influencing how history is taught in schools and how news is consumed in the digital age. We are witnessing the emergence of two distinct realities in America, each with its own set of facts, its own martyrs, and its own villains. Moskowitz warns that this fragmentation of truth is the greatest threat to national security, as it makes the country vulnerable to internal collapse and external manipulation. He advocates for a return to objective standards of evidence and a renewed commitment to the civic values that once united the country across party lines. However, his opponents argue that these objective standards have been co-opted by a political class that uses them to silence any dissent that threatens their power. This fundamental disagreement over the nature of truth itself is the defining crisis of our time. Furthermore, the debate has highlighted a growing generational divide in how Americans view the role and authority of the federal government. Younger generations, raised in an era of pervasive surveillance and digital transparency, are often more skeptical of official narratives than their predecessors. They are more likely to seek out alternative sources of information and to question the motives of institutional leaders like those questioned by Moskowitz. This shift in public attitude presents a significant challenge for lawmakers who are trying to maintain the legitimacy of traditional democratic structures. The hearings have become a battleground where old models of institutional authority are being tested against new models of decentralized, grassroots skepticism. The outcome of this struggle will determine the character of the American government for the remainder of the 21st century. As the final gavels fall on these sessions, the legacy of the January 6th investigations remains an open and highly contested question. For some, It will be remembered as a principled stand for the rule of law and a successful defense of the constitutional order against a violent mob. For others, it will be seen as a missed opportunity for true national reconciliation and a dark chapter in the history of political prosecution. Speciale's testimony serves as a persistent reminder that for millions of Americans, the events of that day were not an end, but a beginning of a new era of political consciousness. The divergence in these views ensures that the truth of January 6th will continue to be litigated in the court of public opinion long after the legal cases have closed. It is a story that is still being written by a people who remain deeply divided on the most fundamental questions of power and justice. The role of technology in both the event itself and the subsequent investigation has also permanently altered the landscape of American political protest. The ubiquity of smartphones and the power of social media algorithms have created a situation where every individual is a broadcaster and every action is recorded from a dozen different angles. Moskowitz has pointed out that this digital footprint has made it easier to identify and prosecute those who broke the law, providing an unprecedented level of evidentiary detail. Yet, this same technology has allowed for the rapid spread of the very conspiracy theories that he seeks to dismantle. The speed at which information travels today makes it nearly impossible for any single institution to control the narrative or manage the public's perception. This digital reality is a double-edged sword that both empowers the law and enables the dissenter. Ultimately, the clash between the institutionalist view of Representative Moskowitz and the outsider critique of Thomas Speciale reflects a healthy, albeit painful, democratic process. It is a process that forces the nation to confront its deepest fears and its most uncomfortable truths in a public forum. While the rhetoric is often harsh and the divisions seem insurmountable, the fact that these debates are happening at all is a testament to the endurance of the American system. The search for a common ground may be slow and fraught with difficulty, but it remains the only viable path forward for a diverse and complex society. As the nation moves toward the next election cycle, the lessons learned, and the lessons ignored, from these hearings will be at the forefront of the voters' minds. The dialogue continues, not as a resolution, but as a necessary step in the ongoing evolution of the American Republic. The question of who is responsible for the tragic events of that day remains the central pivot of the national conversation. Moskowitz insists on a clear line of culpability that leads directly to the individuals on the steps of the Capitol and those who incited them. Speciale insists on a more diffuse responsibility that includes the leaders who failed to plan, the officers who escalated, and the system that ignored the signs of a breaking point. Perhaps the most uncomfortable truth is that both perspectives contain elements of the reality that the country must eventually reconcile. The task of the next generation of leaders will be to weave these disparate threads together into a narrative that allows for both justice and mercy. Only then can the country hope to move beyond the shadow of January 6th and toward a more perfect union. The enduring image of the Capitol under siege will forever serve as a reminder of the fragility of the peace that many Americans had long taken for granted. It has sparked a national debate on the limits of dissent, the role of law enforcement, and the meaning of citizenship in a digital age. Moskowitz and Speciale represent the two poles of this debate, each fighting for the soul of the nation with words and arguments that resonate deep within the American psyche. Their exchange is not just a moment of political theater. It is a reflection of a deep-seated struggle for the future of the American identity. As the lights dim in the hearing room, the echoes of their voices remain, challenging every citizen to decide what kind of country they want to inhabit. The pursuit of a shared truth remains the most difficult and the most essential task facing the American people today.